Hey guys, welcome back to another video brought to you by Crobal Coaching. My name is Jordan Daer, and today we will be discussing the different types of muscles found in your body, as well as how they function. When we think about our muscles, we imagine those that we see when staring at ourselves flexing in the mirror, showing off after our big pump for the day. However, these muscles we see are not the only kinds of muscles found throughout our bodies, as muscles are used by different systems in order for the body to function properly. The muscles we love to build and show off are called skeletal muscles, while the other types are called cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. What are the differences between these three types of muscles? How do our muscles contract to complete movements? And do all the muscles look the same? All these questions and more will be answered in this video on the types and functions of muscles. Skeletal muscle will be the main focus of this video because we need to know all the basics in order to understand the sliding filament theory, which will be discussed later on. Skeletal muscle is literally muscle found on your skeleton. It is the muscle that is attached to your bones, making up to anywhere around 30 to 40% of your muscle mass, and it allows you to perform your day-to-day voluntary movements. What I mean by voluntary is that you control how and when these muscles contract, allowing you to perform actions and movements when you tell them to. A skeletal muscle is made up of bundles of structures called fascicles, and these fascicles are also made up of bundles which are referred to as muscle fibers or cells. If you dive even deeper to see what is inside the muscle fibers, you'll find structures called myofibrils made up of myofilaments. These myofilaments are the structures that actually cause the muscle to contract because of the proteins found within it. When you analyze a skeletal muscle on a microscopic level, scientists refer to it as striated, which means it looks striped because of how the two kinds of myofilaments that exist in the myofibrils are arranged together. The two kinds of myofilaments are called thick and thin myofilaments. These are commonly referred to as actin and myosin, the proteins responsible for the contraction of skeletal muscles. But this is wrong because actin and myosin are only small parts of each myofilament and don't make up the whole thing. Each myofilament contains contractile proteins responsible for allowing a contraction to occur. We will begin with the thin myofilaments, which contain G-actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. G-actin is a sphere-shaped protein that combines with other G-actin molecules to form a helical chain across the thin myofilament. These contain a binding site for the other protein found on the thick myofilaments, called myosin. Tropomyosin is a long protein that partially covers the myosin binding site of several G-actin molecules at a time. It is important to note that these binding sites are only partially covered when the muscle is relaxed. Troponin is a protein that, when the muscle is relaxed, holds the tropomyosin in place to partially cover the myosin binding sites. Thick myofilaments are composed of many different myosin molecules, which they themselves are made up of two long polypeptide chains. The polypeptide chains each have tails which lie along the thick myofilament and heads which branch out to the sides. Like the G-actin molecules found in the thin myofilaments, there is a binding site used to bind actin to the heads of the myosin molecules. However, there is also a spot to bind ATP and break it down, which we'll see when discussing the sliding filament theory. As I mentioned earlier, the thick and thin myofilaments are arranged in such a way that makes our skeletal muscle appear striated. This is because they are joined together at a site called the Z-disc, and each section in between the Z-discs are referred to as sarcomeres, the smallest functional unit of the muscle cell. Now that we have an understanding of what skeletal muscles are, how they are built, and what they are used for, we can dive deeper and look at how the muscle contracts. Our skeletal muscles contract using a method called the sliding filament theory. This theory, in short, says that the myosin heads of the thick myofilaments project outwards so that they can bind to the sites on the G-actin molecules of the thin myofilaments. When this happens, we see what we call a cross bridge where the actin and myosin bind. This leads to a power stroke where the thin myofilaments are pulled towards the center of the sarcomere and the muscle contracts. It's important to remember that the thick and thin myofilaments are not being shortened. It is the small functional unit called the sarcomere that shortens and causes the muscle to contract. Now I know this is a lot of information to take in, But if we dive a little deeper, we can discuss the actin-myosin ATP cycle, where we see the steps our myofilaments take in order to carry out those power strokes and cause a muscle to contract. Please refer back to the section of the video where we discuss skeletal muscles, as the information will be needed to understand this. As I mentioned earlier, our skeletal muscles are used to complete movements that are voluntary. When we decide that we want to move a certain way, our efferent neurons send action potentials or signals from our spinal cords down to our muscles, connecting at a spot called the neuromuscular junction. This is where chemicals are moved to trigger events and signal the muscles to contract. When the muscle fibers sense these signals, the actin-myosin ATP cycle begins by binding ATP, the molecule used for energy, to the myosin heads so it can be broken down into ADP and phosphate. After that happens, calcium that enters the muscle through the neuromuscular junction binds to the troponin to release the tropomyosin covering the myosin binding sites. This allows the cross bridges to be formed. To complete the power stroke, the phosphate from the ATP is released and the myofilaments begin sliding towards each other, ultimately creating a contraction as the sarcomeres shorten. This process happens over and over again by binding more ATP molecules to the myosin heads of the thick filaments. We now understand what skeletal muscles are and how they contract so that we can perform voluntary movements. But it's important to know and understand the second type of muscles found in our bodies, called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is similar to skeletal muscle in that it uses the sliding filament theory to contract and perform movements. However, the kinds of movements, how the myofilaments are arranged, how fast the muscle contracts, and even how it looks is different. Smooth muscle is found within the hollow organs inside our body, such as the stomach, intestines, and liver. This type of muscle is involuntary contracted, which means we can't command them to perform a contraction whenever we like. Smooth muscle is controlled by the autonomic division of our nervous system through hormones, neurotransmitters, and other receptors. Smooth muscle can contract and relax for a variety of reasons, such as controlling blood pressure by helping blood flow, churning food in the stomach so that we can digest it better, and rid the body of toxins through urine. Smooth muscle does not appear striated like skeletal muscle. This is because of the way the myofilaments are arranged within the fibers. The arrangement of the myofilaments also affects the speed of contraction as it contracts and relaxes much slower to allow for longer movements inside of the body. The third and final type of muscle we're going to discuss today is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is the most different from skeletal and smooth muscle in that it can excite itself to produce action potentials and contract. Cardiac muscle appears striated like our skeletal muscle does. However, the cells branch off and connect to the other cells through something called an intercalated disc. These contain gap junctions so that we can move ions from cell to cell. The cardiac muscle cells are called myocardial cells, and there are both contractile myocardial cells, which conduct impulses to move blood out of the heart, and nodal/conducting cells, which aren't really involved in the contraction. However, they move action potentials throughout the heart. To give you an example, there's a nodal cell called the sinoatrial node, or SA node for short, that is referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. This is because it has the fastest spontaneous generation of action potentials in the heart due to its permeability to sodium and calcium, which are the ions that cause the myocardial cells to depolarize and produce an action potential. In summary, myocardial cells serve the purpose of creating action potentials in the heart and pushing blood out of the heart. Throughout your life, if you approached anyone around you and asked them the simple question of, "What is muscle?" I'm sure most people would either awkwardly flex for you or point towards a certain body part as if the muscles you see are the only kind. This is clearly not the case, as there are multiple different types of muscles that look, function, and are located differently. Thank you so much for listening and watching this video on the types and functions of muscles. I'm Daer, and until next time, stay swole.